Oh, hi there. Well, it's been a while, but it looks like you found me. I'm just on my farm, on my tractor, doing some farmy things. And it's Friday, so that can only mean one thing. Climate strike! And if anything, it's even a few degrees hotter than last Friday. So there's no time to lose. This is a climate emergency. You should definitely panic. At least that's what these obnoxious spokes kids keep telling me, like the, greata that everyone's going on about. I went over to the website that is most closely associated with her, Fridays for Futures, I think it's called. And it didn't really have a lot of detail on there. Pretty much all it said was, I want you to panic, which didn't strike me as terribly helpful advice. But I followed some of the links to other organizations and did a little bit of searching. And I found this Elizabeth Klein Solomon character who writes about emergency mode. And she identifies emergency mode as the factor that allowed America or enabled America to mobilize for World War II and win World War II. And one of the advantages of emergency mode that she cites is that in normal mode, you have multiple priorities and you have to balance them and presumably do trade-offs, which she didn't actually use that word because she's probably incapable of comprehending it. But you have to balance priorities, but in emergency mode, you don't have to do that. You can just focus all your resources on one priority, and you don't even have to save resources for the future. It's great. And this is one of the benefits she cites, which just goes to show how totally childish these people are. And their whole mentality, just utterly childish and immature and reckless, blinkered, irresponsible, ignorant, unsophisticated. I mean, I could go on. There's all sorts of synonyms for these things. But, some of it is genuine childishness. A lot of it is genuine childishness. Leftists always seem to think that their points of view are more authoritative coming from a child. And part of it is callous, manipulation also, where, they're going to exploit people's care and concern for children and their desire to protect children in order to advance an agenda. And also, because if anybody is critical, then they can go on the attack and say that you hate children and you attack children. Oh, you're beating up on a little child, but, who somehow also has the wisdom and maturity to lead us, but can't take a little criticism. But, also as with anything leftist, huge double standard here, because, they'll jump on you for criticizing these children who are articulating their childish agendas. But, they'll go after the Covington boys or Soph or mini AOC with a vengeance. So, huge double standard, total hypocrisy, par for the course, the usual leftist stuff. But what do these people actually want? So I looked around for a while, and one thing that I kept seeing over and over again was a total switch to renewable energy or a total elimination of carbon emissions within 5 to 10 years, which is a really aggressive timeline, probably a pretty costly project. But at the same time, these people are also against what they call technical solutions or technological solutions, which could include nuclear energy, carbon capture or sequestration, and also against market mechanisms or market solutions like trading and offsets or carbon taxes. Some of them are okay with carbon taxes, but most are not okay with trading or offsets. And this just betrays them as totally unserious people, because you can't run an industrial or post-industrial civilization on renewable energy, if by that you mean only solar, wind, and water. Nuclear is the only practical alternative to fossil fuels in the near to medium term that can actually produce a large amount of energy reliably, consistently, around the clock, economically. It's the only one. So if you're against nuclear, you're not serious about this. And if you're against technological solutions, you're not serious about this, because technological solutions are often the least cost or market solutions or technological solutions are often the least cost way to achieve a given reduction in emissions. They're probably, even if you're aiming for zero net emissions, there are probably tons of things that are still worth doing, even if you have to capture the carbon that they produce and sequester it. Like, even once you factor in the cost of that, probably tons of things still worth doing. And so the lowest cost solution would be to do the thing and then pay a smaller cost to capture the carbon back, versus not do the thing, which would be a more costly solution. And then for markets, like trading, if you can, let's say, reduce emissions cheaply or economically, then you can sell your emissions quota to somebody who can't reduce their emissions cheaply or who does something very beneficial. And so you can achieve an arbitrary amount of reduction in emissions for the lowest cost in that way, by focusing those reductions where they can come at the lowest cost, and having the trades done so that the places where it's more costly to reduce emissions or more beneficial to emit can still do that. So these people are not serious. Their demands are unreasonable. They're actually impossible. And, their mentality is childish. Their spokespeople are literally children. And this goes so far that a couple of years ago, they were actually all afluttered that they managed to coax Coco the gorilla into saying something vaguely leftist. I don't even remember what it was, or signing something vaguely leftist. And, they were just pleased as punch that they could get a gorilla to agree with their preconceptions in some way, or to say something that they interpreted as agreeing with their preconceptions. And, so I don't think these people are serious. I don't think they're practical. Their demands are not reasonable. Their demands are not possible. And this whole situation is crass and callous and manipulative and exploitative and malicious. And what do they actually want? I don't think it's anything to do with climate. They hate technology. They hate civilization. They hate prosperity as such. They hate humanity. These are profoundly misanthropic people. And I think the climate issue is just something they're trying to use to attack all of these things that they hate, which is all of us and everything that we do. And, they blame technology for all the world's ills. They blame Western civilization for all the world's ills. They blame humanity, which kind of implies that we shouldn't even exist. And they blame prosperity. They blame capitalism. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking capitalism is terrible. It's materialistic and devouring and soulless. Well, yes, but when these people attack capitalism, they're talking about all markets in anything, because they are brain-dead, malicious communists. And so their solutions are not serious solutions. And probably climate isn't even their objective. They're just using it to advance their animosity or antipathy towards civilization, technology, Western civilization in particular, humanity, and prosperity. And they go on and on about climate justice, which mainly seems to consist of redistribution from the first world to the third, from relatively prosperous countries to impoverished countries. And especially done in a careless or haphazard fashion, this is more counterproductive than helpful, because redistributing to the third world is probably likely to only increase its population, which won't increase average prosperity. It'll decrease average prosperity. And that's counterproductive because prosperity is essential to any kind of environmental priorities. If people are struggling to survive or to keep their children fed, they're not worried about the environment. They don't have that luxury. It's only when you're prosperous, when you have taken care of the basics, that you can invest in a luxury like environmentalism And it's only prosperous people who can pursue environmental agendas, because the virtues needed to achieve prosperity, which is like planning for the future and foregoing short-term benefits in exchange for longer-term ones, those are exactly the virtues needed to think in an environmentalist way. So impoverished people can't be environmentalists. Only prosperous people can be. And so, being anti-prosperity as such is counterproductive. And even trying to redistribute from prosperous countries to impoverished countries as a way of hopefully moving them closer to prosperity is also, in many ways, counterproductive, as I'm sure you know. In part because poverty is genetic, and prosperity is also genetic. But for many other reasons on top of that. So these are not serious people. They're fundamentally malicious, misanthropic people. Their demands are unreasonable. Their solutions are unworkable. And I don't even think climate is their real thing that they're going after. They're using climate to push all these other things, these social justice things and socialism things, and global socialism. Now, what do I actually think? That being said, what do I actually think about the climate situation itself? And this is where, basically I think this is one of those cases where the truth is somewhere in the middle, because if you go to the other extreme, look at the denialist side, you see a lot of motivated and dubious reasoning coming from like the oil industry and various business interests and people in general who don't want to change anything that they're doing. And then you look at the alarmist side and you see a lot of motivated and dubious reasoning coming from people who want to change everything, and they're just using this as a justification to do it. And so it's very hard to figure out where the truth is, but I think this is one of those cases where it probably lies somewhere in between. And that's not always the case, but I think this is probably one of the cases. And so it's very hard to figure out what the truth is, just because there's so much bullshit coming from both directions. So I don't know. The answer is I don't know about the climate thing. But I think it's okay to be skeptical. But I think denialism is almost as ridiculous as this alarmism stuff. Total denialism, hard denialism, almost as ridiculous as this alarmism stuff. I saw Elon Musk tweeting this Greta's praises the other day, and I'm going to have to chide him for that, because she is just a brain-dead communist tool. But fundamentally, I think I agree with him that running an experiment like, how much carbon can we put in the air before it breaks things, or, how much can we do to the earth before we break it? That's a really foolish experiment to run. Yeah, you're going to learn the answer to the questions that you seek, but destructive testing of your homeworld is fundamentally not a smart thing to do. You'll get away with a lot more until you find the answer than if you're being more cautious, but by the time you figure it out, it's too late. So I think there probably is a case for caution here, and there probably is a case for change, and we probably have to do some things. I don't know how we're going to be able to rationally figure out, what's going on and what to do with so much propaganda coming from both sides. So we have a very, very tough task ahead of us there, but that is the task. Contra-leftism and contra-denialism. And, one other point I want to make before I sign off is, even if this greenhouse effect stuff is totally bogus and the denialists are right about that, everything we do as an industrial civilization produces waste heat. That's the unavoidable byproduct of all industrial technological activity, is waste heat, whether it's generating energy, using energy, transporting stuff around. Everything we do generates waste heat. And to date, the scale of that has been negligible compared to the sun. But if you project the exponential growth rate of energy use and production from the past into the future, it's going to start to become noticeable. in not too long, less than a couple centuries. And after that, we're going to start hitting hard physical limits as far as what you can do on a single planet and still radiate the heat out into space. Of course, that would radically change the environment, producing that much heat on a single planet. So, I do think we need to make some changes. We do need to start thinking about this. And even if the greenhouse effect is totally bogus, which I'm not convinced that it is, but even if it is, the only thing that changes is the timeline is off by a few dozen years or a few hundred years. But this is stuff we're going to have to confront. And ultimately what we're going to have to end up with even is, some kind of international solution, whether that's a multilateral agreement, ultimately even enforced through, threats of, warfare even. Like this could come to blows, or, some kind of quasi-governmental entity. I hope multilateral would be enough. But it is kind of like a prisoner's dilemma, because you've got a situation with pollution of any kind, whether it's carbon emissions or whatever else, where one country can enrich itself by impoverishing all countries a little bit. And if you let that go unchecked, if you let everybody do that, then everybody ends up impoverished. So we can't allow that fundamentally. And so there are going to have to be some controls at some point. And hopefully, multilateral agreements backed up by threats between the major regional powers, because that seems to be the world we're heading towards. Not a superpower-dominated world, but a regional power-dominated world. Hopefully that will be sufficient, because I really don't like the idea of global government. But that may end up being a productive and profitable thing, on a limited scale, just like it was productive and profitable in the past to conquer trade routes, because when trade routes were passing through multiple jurisdictions, each jurisdiction had the incentive to tax those trade routes at a much higher than optimal level so that it could extract the most taxes out of its section of the trade routes. Well, it ended up being counterproductive, because that decreases trade along the whole route and everybody pays. All right, so it's the same phenomenon, same dynamic, and it's profitable and productive to conquer the whole trade route, lower taxes, more trade. You get more tax revenue than all of the independent jurisdictions were before. So that happened in the past. That's a historical phenomenon. Something like that may happen in the future, unless we can figure out some other way to deal with, environmental externalities. So until later, don't panic.